Hi, I'm Adrian Schenker, Executive Director of Bradbury-Sullivan LGBT Community Center, and welcome to our 2021 LGBT Spirituality Symposium. This year's theme is Black, Queer, and Spiritual, and we are so thrilled to welcome Pastor Jamie Frazier and Rabbi Sandra Lawson, as well as event moderator Rabbi Steven Nathan. We host this important community conversation on Martin Luther King Jr. Day to honor and celebrate Black lives, Black spirituality, and social justice. Bradbury-Sullivan LGBT Community Center unequivocally believes that Black lives matter. We should first acknowledge that we do this work on Walking Treaty land, the original and unceded land of the Lenape people. If you're in need of closed captioning for this event, captions are available for those watching on YouTube. And finally, this event is made possible thanks to grants from the Rhodes and Leona B Carpenter Foundation and St. John's UCC Allentown, as well as from donors like you. This is a free event today, and we're so glad that you're here. But we also welcome your donation at bradburysullivancenter.org/donate. For those in a position to give, we welcome your donation. Please welcome Pastor Jamie Frazier, Rabbi Sandra Lawson, and Rabbi Steven Nathan.
Hi, everyone. My name is Rabbi Steve Nathan. I am the Director of Jewish Student Life and Associate Chaplain at Lehigh University in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, and I would like to welcome you all to the 2021 LGBT Spirituality Symposium sponsored by the Bradbury-Sullivan LGBT Center in Allentown. And our topic this year, as you're probably aware, is Black, Queer, and Spiritual. And I would like to introduce briefly our two speakers and then give them an opportunity to introduce themselves a little bit. So our first presenter today is Rabbi Sandra Lawson, and she received her ordination from the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College in Wyncote, Pennsylvania in June 2018. She was born in St. Louis, Missouri, and grew up in a military family, and graduated from St. Leo University magna cum laude with a Bachelor of Arts degree in sociology. She also holds a Master of Arts degree in sociology from Clark Atlanta University. Rabbi Sandra has served in the United States military as a military police person with a specialty in military police investigations, specializing in cases involving child abuse and domestic violence. Upon leaving the military, she started a personal training business and later worked as an adjunct instructor of sociology at local community colleges. She has also served as the investigative researcher for the Anti-Defamation League's Southeast region, becoming the go-to person when law enforcement in the South needed information on hate groups. She's also an opinion writer for the Jewish publication The Forward. And Rabbi Sandra's vision as a rabbi is to help build a more inclusive Jewish community where all who want to come are welcome. Diversity is embraced, and we can come together to learn and to pray. Rabbi Sandra is currently serving as the Associate Chaplain for Jewish Life and the Senior Jewish Educator at Hillel at Elon University in Elon, North Carolina. And she also has a great social media presence on Instagram and Facebook, and I think other places, but I'll let her tell you more about that. And then our second guest this evening is Reverend Jamie Frazier, affectionately known as Pastor J, and he loves working at the intersection of race, sexuality, and religion. He founded and leads the Lighthouse Church of Chicago, UCC. The heart of the church's mission is clearly expressed in its motto: passionate about Jesus, serious about justice. Lighthouse is a predominantly Black LGBTQ+ affirming church that welcomes all people. Jamie attended Vanderbilt University for his undergraduate studies on a full tuition scholarship. A celebrated orator, Jamie addresses the historic March on Springfield for Marriage Equality, as well as helped open the 2014 LGBTQ Youth Homelessness Summit with words of encouragement and hope. He appeared on CNN and several local Chicago news affiliates, been featured in Newsy, and his church work was referenced in the Washington Post. Pastor Jay has keynoted and presented workshops at various academic institutions, ranging from the University of Chicago to DePaul to Loyola University. His passion and hard work were recognized by Chicago Theological Seminary when he received the inaugural 2017 Bayard Rustin Award for outstanding service and commitment to the work of social justice, which, as an aside, I just have to say is appropriate since if we were doing this in person, the Bradbury-Sullivan Center is on Bayard Rustin Way in Allentown. Lastly, in 2019, Reverend Frazier organized a movement for Black queer liberation into an organization called Lighthouse Foundation, which is a non-sectarian, nonprofit social justice organization that advances justice for Black LGBTQ people across Chicagoland through empowerment, education, and entertainment. So now that you've heard everything about our two guests, they don't need to say anything themselves. No, I'll now ask each of them to tell us a little bit about themselves in their own words. So Rabbi Lawson, would you like to begin?
Yes. Yeah. I always find it interesting talking about myself after my bio is read, and listening to your bio is just really an interesting experience. So yeah, my name is Rabbi Sandra Lawson, and I do serve as the Associate Chaplain for Jewish Life and the Hillel Jewish Educator at Elon University in North Carolina, an amazing school with amazing students who I'm just proud to work with every day. Um, as Stephen said, I was ordained in 2018, and my vision, and I put that vision statement on my resume, and at one time it's been a signature block. It may still be, but I believe I want to create a space where all are welcome, and my theology is often I'm clergy. Um, I'm clergy, and I'm sorry, I have dogs in the background who are making a lot of noise because it's dinner time. Um, anyway, so I'm clergy who happens to be Jewish, and I use Jewish values to pastor to people, and to try to help. This is not about proselytizing. It's just that I want to be able to serve and help as many people as I can. I know many of you might be wondering, Black Jews. That's a question that I get a lot. And yes, depending on which of the last three studies that have looked at Jewish demographics, the Jewish population of color, people of color, is anywhere from 10 to 15 to 20% of the American Jewish population self-identifies as people of color. And with that, every rabbinical school right now, every progressive rabbinical school, so I'll say non-Orthodox, but I even believe even in Orthodox rabbinical schools, have Black students in them. And they also have other students of color. So there is a growing number of Jews of color, Black Jews, brown Jews, who will be ordained as rabbis in the coming years. And that just will reflect the growing racial diversity of the American Jewish population. And Jews have been in the United States long enough where whatever statistical demographic you see in the American population, you will start to see in the Jewish population. So I'm a rabbi. I also have this aspiration to sort of be a musician, and I play instruments. I try very hard. I'm not trying to give up my day job. I just believe that for me, music is prayer, and singing taps into the sort of our neshama, our soul, our heart, and gets me out of my headspace. So I'm not thinking with my head, and my heart is full. And so singing during our services sort of helps awaken my soul, and I hope awakens other people's souls. And I think there's something beautiful about singing. I'm also one of those people that believe everybody can sing. Doesn't mean everybody can sing great, but I do believe everybody can sing. And creating communities of singing is something that I hope to continue to do. I'm also a researcher and a writer. My background is sociology, and so I've been able to take my sort of my view of society and sociology, and sort of helps sort of frame how I see my role as a rabbi. And also with some of the challenges that we've been facing in this past year, with COVID and being locked up, not locked up, but being like confined, which has also spurred a lot of racial tension and protesting. My background kind of helps the Jewish. I use my background to help the Jewish community understand how we got where we are today, and how do we become better going forward. I'm also not really comfortable talking about myself. I'm better with answering questions, and I'm kind of feeling like I'm just rattling on. So I will pause and let my partner Jamie go. And then I'm looking forward to having our conversation.
Thank you, Rabbi Lawson. Or as we said yesterday, the three of us are all clergy, so we can certainly be on first name basis
Yes,
with each other. So now I'd like to ask, I guess, Pastor Jay, Pastor Frazier, to tell us a little bit about himself.
You know, I share Sandra's reticence to talk about self. As preachers, I view myself as a storyteller. So it's my responsibility to tell another story that situates all of our individual stories. But I would like to share what has led me to becoming the pastor of Lighthouse Church UCC. I'd like to use the image of a mosaic, because each of the experiences that have led me to this place function as a story shard that amalgamated represents what has led me to this place and gives me the strength to continue in it. And I think it's very important to talk about the experiences that lead us to our present, because there's so many Black queer folk, so many white queer accomplices who, like all of us, are struggling with identity and trying to figure it all out, but we're all on a journey. And for me, as much as I'm focused on the destination, I also am focused on the steps that constitute that journey. So I grew up in the AME Church, African Methodist Episcopal. I grew up in Moncks Corner, South Carolina, 2 stop signs, 1 stoplight. We were the big folks church. So if you were an African American in Moncks Corner who worked in industry or worked in corporate America or worked in politics, you came to our church. It was the place of the pipe organ. It was the place of the stole and all of the vestments that country folk could muster. And then after growing up African Methodist, I went to college at Vanderbilt in Nashville. And there I attended a former Church of God in Christ, an independent Pentecostal church. And this was a place where, for the first time, I saw people dancing down the aisles. I saw spiritual practices in motion. I saw folks laid out on the floor, because we didn't do this at the dignified AME church that I grew up in. So it was a place where I got to see another stream of what it means to be Christian. And this was yet another shard that forms the mosaic of what has become Lighthouse Church and ultimately what has become my life. When I got done with Vanderbilt in Nashville, I ended up coming to Chicago, and I went about as far as my Black queer Pentecostal feet could take me. I wound up in Winnetka, Illinois, at a North Shore congregation where their idea of affordable housing was $500,000 to $800,000 a year. It was a different kind of space, but it was the kind of space for the first time in which I could be Black and queer and Christian. And these rich white folks didn't quite know what to do with me. But it was a place of exploration and embrace, and it allowed me to do the kind of healing necessary to work with other folks and create Lighthouse Church. It is imperative when we come from experiences of marginalization and trauma that we have some safe space to heal, a place to kind of integrate all of our identities so that when we go back to serve our community, we do so with wholeness and we do so from a place of healing. I do believe we are called, as Parker Palmer says, to be wounded healers. And then after spending time in the North Shore for a year and a half, I journeyed back into Chicago proper, and I worked for a multi-site United Methodist Church that was LGBTQ plus affirming. And it was a powerful opportunity for me to see what this kind of space could look like in the city that by that point, I had called home for about 3 or 4 years. It was a predominantly white United Methodist space, but it showed me what was possible for my community. When I talk about my experience in that space, I say that, I learned marketing well, I learned leadership well, and I often found myself saying, if I could take this and put some seasoning on it, I think my people would benefit from it. And so Lighthouse Church kind of looks like that. The mission of Lighthouse Church, we are a predominantly Black LGBTQ plus affirming church that welcomes all people, and that is my heart. My call is to be unapologetically Black and unabashedly queer. And Lighthouse Church represents shards of all of the experiences that I have enumerated. We have some folks who come in with 3-piece suits, very reminiscent of the AME church. We find ourselves singing as a congregation, "Let us break bread together on our knees," because I heard that song when I sat in my grandmother's lap in the AME church, but I never thought I would sing that song as I held my partner's hand in church. The time that I spent in a former Kojic church while I was in Nashville, an independent Pentecostal church, at Lighthouse Church, and also me. Some of us speak in tongues, we dance down the aisles, we run around the room. It is a place of charismaticism, exuberance, and communal joy. I bring that experiential shard from my experience in the Pentecostal church. When I was in the North Shore, it was my first experience watching church members publicly and openly disagree with the pastor. And it was liberating, it was invigorating, and I wanted to bring that kind of culture of critical inquiry, of disrupting the power balance that we too often embed in religious spaces. I wanted to bring that into Lighthouse Church, and to the greatest extent we can, we have strived to do that. Lighthouse Church is 7 years old. I have been out now as a Black queer clergy person for 8, 9 years. And Lighthouse Church strives to do what I would want done for me as a member of a religious community. I speak of Lighthouse Church as the first member. I wanted a place where there was prophetic preaching, where there was gospel music, where there was vulnerable transparency, deep, real, meaningful connection. Because those are things that I hunger for as a Black queer person. And this beautiful mosaic that has become Lighthouse Church in my life, every time that I step back and I look at it, I see the shards. I see the old Black church mothers in the AME church. I see the congregational meetings in North Shore where I learned some things about how to do business. I see the voices and celebration of charismatic, independent Pentecostalism. All of that has come to form the mosaic of my experience, and I'm excited to talk more about that.
Great. Thank you so much, Jamie. There's just, so much material to talk about. Both of you just sort of got the tip of the iceberg. So I have a few questions to hopefully spark some conversation. And for two people who don't like talking about themselves, you both did a good job of doing it, which was great. So obviously the subject matter, the title of this symposium, again, this is an annual LGBT LGBTQ Spirituality Symposium sponsored by Bradbury-Sullivan, but this year's theme is Black, Queer, and Spiritual. So we're talking about the intersectionality of those three identities. And so the question I have for each of you is, just to start out, how do you find that these three identities, or others as well, how do they intersect for you? And in terms of, both in terms of your personal life and your professional life, realizing that the two are not, totally distinct. They certainly overlap each other. Right, how do these three identities affect you? How do they interact with each other? Do you find that one or more is easier to navigate in certain circumstances? And again, as I said, personal versus professional. So since we started with Sandra the last time, and I guess in terms of the format, I'd like each of you to respond, but then obviously dialogue is a great thing. So Jamie, perhaps if you want to start with your response to that in terms of the intersectionality and how those three play a role in your life, and then Sandra, you can share what you want to.
Yeah, let me speak to them individually, almost like stars, and then let me speak about them collaboratively, almost like a constellation. I first also want to thank you, Steve, and I want to thank Adrian, the executive director, for this opportunity. I'm just so grateful. Anytime that Lighthouse Foundation has the chance to build deeper bonds with other LGBT centers across the nation, it's fabulous. I had a long conversation with Adrian a couple months ago in which I picked his brain about any number of things. And that wisdom has become a part of what Lighthouse Foundation does now. So when I think of Blackness, I think of rhythm. I think of rhythm not merely in terms of dance, but I think of rhythm in terms of defiance. I think of a way that you move through the world that is innovative, that is cool, that is sexy, that marches to a rhythm that white supremacy cannot always discern. There's a pep in the step of Black folk. There's some swagger in the way that we move across the sidewalk, even when we are faced with police brutality. So when I think of Blackness, I think of creativity, I think of beauty, I think of cool defiance. When I think of queerness, I think of disruption. I think of that which disrupts what people call normal, or customary, or appropriate. I think of stuff that is innovative, that changes the landscape because it is authentic and it is born of suffering, but it is not wholly defined by suffering. And when I think of Christianity, I'm not an exclusivist, but I am a particularist. I believe that folk need to speak from their particular traditions if we are to say anything meaningful and intelligible about the divine. And when I think about what it means to be Christian, it means community. It means an awareness that our story is important, but our story finds its fullest and most complete expression in the stories of others and ultimately the story of Christ. And I am also a Christian because I am in love with this idea of this God who comes in corporeal form and is born in a city where people say nobody good can come from, and is born to a young mother who is marginalized by her community because they have some issues around her birth. Jesus excites me because there's a coolness in his swagger. And there's also a way in which he is disruptive. So when you talk about how do I understand myself as a Black queer Christian, first of all, I don't prioritize any of those identities. They are all symbiotic. But for me, a Black queer Christian is someone who has this rhythm with which they move through life that is undaunted. And they are a disruptive force in this world. And they seek to embody the values of Christ, which means we bring that rhythm and that disruption into community, into connection with others, and ultimately the God who has formed us.
Well, see if you could repeat the question, please. You're muted. You're still muted.
It would not be a Zoom call or a Zoom program if somebody wasn't speaking while muted, right? So we've now gotten rid of that. I was the guinea pig there. Okay. So now that I unmuted myself and I scrolled up to where my question was, it was basically about you're looking at, again, a Black, queer, and spiritual. How do those three identities intersect in your life? Do you find it easier or more difficult to navigate specific aspects of your intersectionality within specific settings, specific communities? And also if there's any difference in terms of how it works in your personal life and your professional life.
Yeah. So what's interesting, I think, and also this will also depend, you're asking this question today. My answer might be slightly different tomorrow, but overall, that's kind of the same. I'm someone who serves as the spiritual leader, guider, walker, througher, for a Jewish community, and for me, I only can see the world through a Black, queer, female Jewish lens. That's how I see the world, and it informs and shapes how I navigate through it. And I also work in predominantly white spaces, and even though Jews who came from Eastern Europe were not seen as white when they immigrated to this country, whiteness has evolved, and many American Jews have moved into whiteness at a cost, just like every other European group that moved into whiteness has lost some part of their culture. And also American Jews who do benefit from white privilege also can suffer from anti-Semitism at the same time, and white privilege can be taken away. And both of those things are together. And I'm saying all of that sometimes because I think many of my Jewish brothers and sisters don't necessarily understand that or are grappling with it. And so even though all of my sort of identities are sort of in one, I move through a world and a society that will always see my Blackness before they see any other part of me or even get to know me. And that has a lot to do with where we are in our society, the foundation of our society, and race and racism. And on a regular basis, not as often as I used to get asked this question, but recently, as of yesterday, I was asked, so which identity do you put in front? Which one is more important to you? And I say a variety of things, but it is true for anyone who has multiple identities that they all don't show up at the same time, and people can pick and choose. Just like many of my white Jewish friends don't necessarily often disclose that they are Jewish, and there's a lot of reasons for that. But like I said, that my people see my Blackness before they see me. That doesn't mean that my Blackness is more important than any other part of me. We just live in a racist society, and I'm also queer, and I'm also Jewish, and I kind of feel like that gives me like a superpower. I don't see this as some people have said to me, "Oh, that must be so bad." I'm like, really, my life is fine. But when I say superpower, I see things that many of my friends and colleagues don't see because they are just used to believing that certain values are shared, or they don't necessarily realize that there's not any people of color in the room, or there's not any queer people of color in the room, and there's not any people with disabilities in the room, or maybe those people are in the room but they don't see them. Like the amount of times I have been in Jewish spaces, even as the rabbi, where people don't know that I'm the rabbi. That I'm not coded as Jewish because people see Jews often have ideas in their head of what a Jew looks like, and my own personal life, my Jewish values, my practice for self-care, all of that stuff helps me navigate the challenges that are in our society. I have a prayer practice every morning. I have an exercise practice, and all of that helps me to navigate some of the challenges that may exist in the society. And I don't really see them as challenges because, as a Black person in the United States, I grew up in a society that I have always lived in a society that was racist. I'm saying it that way because many of my white friends are just realizing that we live in a society that's racist, and that awakening for them has been really interesting to watch sometimes. But I am grateful every day that I am who I am, and I can only be me. And when I as my students who work with me, um, love that I am all of these things, and it's also sending a message to our young people. Whatever my students thought about a rabbi before they came to college, or a Jewish person, whatever ideas they had, by working with me and having me be their rabbi, that is forever changed. They can no longer move through the world and say, well, people of color can't be rabbis, women can't be rabbis, queer people can't be rabbis, because somebody who guided them and witnessed them through the 4 years of this transition from parents' house before they go off into the world, it's an honor and a privilege for me to help shape their spiritual life as a Black queer person. And so, like, all of me shapes my spirituality. All of that informs how I move through our society.
Thank you. I don't know if the two of you have any, again, like I said, we don't have to be stuck with, okay, I ask, each of you answer, then we go on to the next question. So certainly if the two of you want to have any questions for each other or continue on this conversation. I will say that the other thing I was going to throw in next, which is sort of connected, is also how you bring your various identities into your reading of scripture and sacred text. So I'll just throw that out. I'll just add that into the mix and throw it out to both of you, and whoever wants to respond first. Or
I'll go. This is an area of my job that I really like a lot. And I also want to echo what Jamie said earlier. I'm just really grateful that I have this platform, and I'm grateful that you all have invited me. I just got a message from Adrian about this, and so I'm really just excited to be this. And I often to be here, and I often don't get to be in a space with other people of color, and so that Jamie, so thank you for that, and also to be with a friend, Steve, so thank you, and a colleague. That's really great. So the reason I love this particular question is I'm going to go back a generation. And so for the longest time, I have said more than a generation, but for the longest time, Jewish texts were seen through the eyes of men. Men, who we believe wrote these texts, men who translated these texts, men who provided commentary to these texts. I'm not saying there weren't any women. I'm just saying that is a history that I just don't know. And there have been women throughout history that have provided commentary on Jewish texts, but the ones that we have typically lifted up are for men. The feminist movement came along in the 60s. And then you have this wave of women having access to text, translating text, studying text, becoming rabbis, translating text. And so now all of a sudden, instead of looking at text through the lens of men who see things a particular way, now we have another group of people coming in and lifting up stories that men just didn't really pay as much attention to. Or really looking at some of our translations, like looking at alternative ways of translating and not just assuming that these words can mean certain things. Because when you translate things, you have to make choices. And so I am someone, as a queer person, that has benefited from the feminist movement. So those women who came along looking at our text through a feminist lens. And then the next group of people, queer people, came along and looked at our text, and sort of queer people benefiting from the feminist movement and queering our text, or maybe looking at some of our historical figures, or some of the texts in the Talmud or whatever, and like, some of these people may have been queer. Some of these things look kind of queer, or maybe let's look at some of these relationships. That's not to say that we know if they were or not, but now we have this broader perspective, and now, as a more racially diverse group of people start to become trained as rabbis, they are also looking at text and seeing text differently than our white colleagues are saying and so are looking at. And so I am someone who loves to, let's look at our text and what do our texts say about racism. Let's look at our text and see what they say about sexism. Let's look at what our texts say about what our society is doing right now, because the things that we are doing now in our society has happened before, and the rabbis of our tradition have struggled with many of the same things that we're struggling with. And so that's my answer.
Jamie, do you have anything you'd want to add to that?
Yeah. But one of the things that I've been thinking about is, what is distinctive about a Black queer spirituality? I think one of the things that it demands is a hermeneutic of suspicion. Whenever I come to the text, I'm suspicious. Who's writing the text, and when was it written, and why was it written? What issues was it addressing in the moment? Then also, who gets to decide whether an interpretation is orthodox in the academy or traditional in the church? And who do interpretations benefit? And so I'm constantly challenging congregants at Lighthouse Church to ask hard questions of the resources that they read, and also the presenters that go before them, to ask tough questions of me. What is my interpretation? How does it either promote human flourishing and more people at the table, or diminish people's humanity? I mean, these are the questions that we have to bring to every speaker. And so that interpretive lens of suspicion, and that's natural for Black folk and queer folk, but for some reason, when we come to biblical text, because we have not kind of unembedded toxic theology, we want to leave out the suspicion that we have inherently as Black folk and queer folk. And I'm like, no, beloved, let's bring all of that to the text. Because, as Paul says, study to show yourself approved as a workman not ashamed to rightly divide the word of truth. Critical inquiry is the best of our tradition. Another thing that I think of, and I was just thinking of some common biblical characters shared between our traditions, Sandra. I think of the Song of Songs. I think of the Shulamite woman, who is Black. I think of Hagar, who is an Egyptian. And white folks like to rewrite history, but the Egyptians were Black. They were dark skinned, they were brown skinned. They certainly were not European white folk. I think of Moses, who was married to Zipporah, a Black woman, a Cushite. And then I think of Jesus, who is raised by a single mother, who has a stepfather that is skeptical, who is coming from a hometown where folks say, can anything good come from it, south side of Chicago, who is under constant threat of police brutality from Rome. If that ain't a Black man, I don't know what is. And even in Revelation, we are told that his hair is woolly and his skin is bronze. And when we think about the Middle East, this was a brown person who had clearly Black folk in his lineage. I mean, did you hear me cite Hagar? So I think it is important to not to remember and to constantly retain that Blackness is in the text. And also queerness is in the text. I think of David and Jonathan. I think of this relationship between two men that was somehow closer than a relationship with a man to a woman. I think of how one of them bows down prostrate in front of the other in the presence of people. There's something queer about that. So the first thing we have to do is shake our finger in the face of homophobes and say we are here because we have always been here. And a core tenet of Lighthouse Church is that God is a Black trans woman. And we defend this theological proposition on two bases. First, when we talk about God from the Trinitarian perspective, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, or if we want to be more gender inclusive, creator, redeemer, sustainer, creator, God as creator in the text is imaged as father, imaged as mother, and also imaged as divine other, which I think is a shout out to gender nonconforming folk, right? Somebody who exists beyond and disrupts the gender binary and turns it on its face, right? God is an all consuming fire. How do we put gender to that? And the creator is mother and father, and it's all of those things. That's transness. When we talk about transness, it's when your identification does not match your label. And I think there are lots of folk who try to label and box in God, but we got to be clear that oftentimes people's designation does not necessarily match their identification. How they are described doesn't match how they define themselves. And we have described God the creator as male when God is clearly so many more things. And then also when you even move beyond creator, when you look at spirit in the Hebrew Bible is ruach, it's feminine. It's a woman. So when I talk about the Holy Spirit at Lighthouse Church, it's Big Mama, because that's something that resonates with Black queer people, particularly Black queer men, because when nobody would love us, Big Mama would. And so thinking about the Parakletos, the one who was called alongside us as Big Mama, offers some restoration and healing for traumatized Black queer people. And then when we think of Jesus, yes, I see this Jesus as a man, but Lord, there's something queer about this Jesus. He's spending time in the woods with 12 men. We don't seem to know where his wife is. I mean, this is somebody who is redefining sexuality in the way that we might suspect it to be practiced. So there's just all kind of Blackness and queerness and subversion and suspicion all up in the text and in our tradition. And I think that it is important that we share it with this kind of intentionality, because it was hard for me as a Black queer person to find a church, because I would join these LGBT affirming churches and they were talking about Ralph Waldo Emerson. They were not talking about Jesus. And for me, I wanted to get to an affirming space, not in spite of the tradition, but through the tradition. And I think there are a whole lot of queer folk, particularly Black queer folk, that are tired of being pandered to. And we are ready for the deep, critical, theological inquiry work. We just need folks to guide us in a way that recognizes we're all on a journey.
So I'm just thinking, what a lot of what both of you have said in some people's mind would be seen as heretical. I personally, I can't remember who the quote is by, but for some people, heaven is heresy, and for other people, heresy is heaven. And I guess I fall in the latter category. But so even if it's not heretical, it's certainly not the quote unquote traditional read white male way of looking at things. So I'm curious, I'm just thinking back to when I was in rabbinical school and years ago. I remember talking at a bunch of us who were sitting around the lounge area, and we were talking about David and Jonathan and a queer reading of David and Jonathan, which is, we're talking about the early 90s, maybe late 80s. And I remember one of our professors walking by and he looked at me and came to me afterwards. He said, "Do you really buy into that? I wouldn't expect that of you." Now, I identified as straight back in those days, so that may have been why. But he thought it was just ridiculous. It was more the traditional rabbinic way of looking at it. This was the paradigmatic, non-sexual love relationship between two men, which I don't know. I don't see it that way. But so I felt that pushback. So I'm curious for the two of you, do you feel that you get pushback on these ways of reading text, and how do you help people to understand it rather than just saying, "Oh, well, they don't get it, forget it, I'm not going to bother with them"? Because the people that we all have to deal with as clergy is to really talk to the people who don't agree with us and to help them to see our perspective, even if they still don't agree with us at the end of it. So I'm just curious how that, in terms of all the things we just talked about, how that plays out in your rabbinate, in your ministry. Oh, now you're muted.
I don't get a lot of pushback, and largely right now because of the population that I work with, these are not things that come up. But when I do bring up some texts that I think might be quite radical, many of our students are smart. Like many of our students have had women rabbis. Google's very powerful. And so not all, but many of our students are already open to some of the things that I have to say. And but I also use my social media platforms. These days, I've often been called the TikTok rabbi. And I use these platforms as a way to connect with people, as a form of public theology, to connect with people, with Jews, and anyone else who wants to listen. Because as you know, many young people just aren't coming to synagogues, and that's fine with me. I'll just go where they are. But every once in a while when I post something where I don't think it's that radical, I mentioned this to you all the other day, we were talking, and we were in one of the things I love about Judaism is that Jews are reading the same text all the time throughout the year cycle, whether you're reading the Torah or the Talmud, it's like all the same stuff at the same time if you're reading those things. And we were at the story of, Joseph when his brothers sold him into slavery. And, I queered that text, but I can't even take credit for it because I learned it from other rabbis who came along before me, who quoted. If you're going to quote somebody in the Jewish tradition, you pick this guy named Rashi. Rashi is like the first commentator, and Rashi said that. Joseph liked to dress his eyes and touch up his lips, and so he could appear more good looking. And in reading Rashi, and there's more to it than that. I'm not trying to say that Rashi thought that Joseph was queer. I'm not trying to say that I know Joseph was queer, but I'm saying looking at it through our lens today, he was definitely not buying into binary. And Rashi thought there was something interesting enough about Joseph to write that down centuries ago. But I'm telling you this because I didn't think that was such a radical thing. And someone on social media who said that they weren't homophobic, but liked to follow me, but she says that she likes to follow me. So like, it's not unusual for me to post about queer stuff. But she thought it was, that it was inappropriate for me to make all these assumptions about Joseph. I said, I'm not making any assumptions. I'm quoting a text. I'm quoting a commentator on a text and when I asked for more of what her issue was with what I wrote, she thought I was baiting her. And I said, no, I can understand the toxicity of social media, but I'm really curious if you follow me and you like the things that I say, what is it about this text, that my commentary on this text, which isn't an original commentary, like this is a pretty mainstream idea of how we read Joseph in progressive Jewish spaces. And so like that's sometimes the pushback that I get, and most of the time, a lot of the pushback I get is just from people who don't believe women should be rabbis.
I haven't gotten a whole lot of pushback because I preach to the hungry. When I started Lighthouse Church, I had a mentor say to me, because I was getting into these long, protracted Facebook page debates with people about how homosexuality wasn't a sin, and here's how you deal with the clobber passages. I mean, that would take hours to type out all of these responses. And I had a mentor reach out to me and say, look, you can either build what you're building, or you can spend your time responding to the detractors. You can't do both. And there's so many people who want to hear what you have to say. Why not spend your time working with them? And I was like, you're right. And one of the ways that we do it, I feel like if we're going to create this kind of healing Black queer space, then we're going to have to sit at the feet of Black women. I think of Professor Will Gaffney. I think of Reverend Linda Hollies. I also think of Reverend Dr. Renita Weems. In one of the ways that, let me say this, it's been interesting as I do ministry in, with, and among Black queer folk, because for so many of them, I'm the first person who has said homosexuality isn't a sin, you know? So I joke sometimes, as I started this church, you know, I walked in like George Bush, mission accomplished. I was like, oh, they're gonna greet me as a liberator, you know? But some folk are so bound that they don't even know that they are enslaved by toxic theology. And this is a real question that I sit with, is how do you liberate folk that don't even realize they're in chains? And that has really been the work of Lighthouse Foundation as a predominantly Black queer congregation. And so I have these folks who come into our space and they're like, well, I never heard this before. You know, I've never heard this interpretation and this position before. And one of the things I'm very dedicated about in Lighthouse Church is expository preaching, biblical scholarship, sharing the sources. You know, so if I'm going to quote Dr. Gaffney and she's written an article, share the article with the congregation so that Black women, Black queer women are able to go to these resources and find new and innovative ways of engaging with the text that is faithful with our tradition. You know, this kind of biblical idolatry is really a recent modern white evangelical tradition. When you look at Luther and other theologians, there was an understanding that the word of God was what was spoken, what was heard, what was experienced, the person of Jesus Christ. But now the word of God has become the words on the page. And so now we are worshiping the text and we are not worshiping God. And it's nothing short of idolatry. I mean, I think the two greatest idols of the modern church right now is heterosexuality and the Bible. You know, folks are looking for everything to worship except the Lord and to be in communion with each other. So I really try to expose folks to new scholars, the people that I'm reading, and take them through the text, take them through word studies. People are intelligent. Folks got all kind of websites on their phone. So I remember sitting in theology classes and people would tell me, oh, the folks ain't ready for this. You know, we can only keep this in the classroom. And I'm like, actually, I think people are ready for a sexual ethic that is not only monogamous. People are so ready, they're doing it. So I think we need to at least be able to have those kinds of conversations and do so honestly, transparently. So I've found that deep study and transparency has helped with the resistance of folk within my own community who need to be liberated from toxic fear.
You know, it's funny that for a second there, I was going to say, okay, so how would you understand your theology? How do you find queer theology, queer belief, queer practice differs from, for lack of a better term, straight theology? And then I realized, wait a second, we're three queer people here talking about it. You know, all we can do is talk about our own experiences as queer people, and that's exactly what you've been doing. And I think, one of the other things we talked about the other day, and the upside to doing this on Zoom is that so many more people are going to be able to see this than if it were just in Allentown. But the downside is we don't know who these people are. So, it helps to know who your audience is. So I think I'm just assuming we're having a very mixed audience. And I think for, I would imagine that for queer people of color who are listening to the two of you speaking, there's hopefully going to be either something that resonates or something that, something they've never heard before, or something that they can grasp onto as queer people of color. But also for, one thing we talked about when we were talking the other day is also for white folks in terms of how do I know that for me, with everything that's been going on this year, the one thing I try to remember to do is to ask, how can I be an ally as a white man specifically? How can I be an ally, not making an assumption? So I guess in terms of people out there who aren't Black, queer, and spiritual. Maybe they're one, maybe they're two, maybe they're none. What would you say in terms of, I guess, issues of allyship, or, we have about a little over 5 minutes left. So, what's the message you would want to send out to other people as well? I mean, you've touched on this a little bit in terms of what you were saying earlier.
So I will answer that, but I also want to, your statement reminded me of something when religious people started putting, or rabbis, ministers, imams, whatever, started putting stuff online. There was, at some point, there was like an uptick in people searching for Judaism, or an uptick in conversions. And for many in the Jewish community, they were really sort of like, why are people all of a sudden interested in Judaism? And so when rabbis started putting their stuff out there, they were putting it out there to a Jewish audience. But as you mentioned, like, just because you put it out there to a Jewish audience, but it lives and breathes and moves. And so one of the things that the internet has allowed, has shown us, is that there are people who find Judaism attractive, and want to ask more questions about it. And for people who are spiritual seekers, the internet has allowed them to move outside of whatever religion that they came up with, if they came up with one. But it's I just wanted to say that. But in terms of allyship is important, as we talked the other day, or yesterday, that we're all on this journey of trying to be better human beings. No one is perfect. We're all on this journey of trying to remove ourselves from the shackles of racism, and that our society from the very beginning was designed to privilege one group of people over another group of people. And that being an ally, whether you're trying to be an ally to queer people or trying to be an ally to people of color, we're going to make mistakes, but to keep your heart open and lean into the uncomfortableness of messing up, so that we can grow. Because if you're so worried about making a mistake, you're not going to do anything. But we learn through our mistakes, and we learn how to be better by making mistakes. And so I want people to get out of their segregated shuttles, to speak, because too many people in our country do not have relationships with people outside of their own race. And the more we can interact with people, the more we actually see that we have more things in common than there are differences. And one of the blessings I have of where I work, every day I get to work with a pastor, a priest, and an imam. It sounds like a joke, but I really do work with these people, and I have learned so much just from being in relationship with him.
So at Lighthouse Church, we use the language of accomplice. And let me also say this. I feel like sometimes liberals, we spend so much time trying to figure out the right word that we forget what the hell we're even talking about. But we use the word accomplice with fierce intentionality, because I want white folk to understand you are not helping Black people. You are actually helping yourself, because racism diminishes the soul and the capacity to love of white folk. So I need white folk to fight, not for me. I need you to fight for your own souls and your own humanity and your own capacity to experience full, deep, meaningful relationships that currently is arrested and stymied by institutionalized racism. So I think the biggest shift for white folk in 2021 has got to be, I'm committed to anti-racism because my soul, my future, the world that my children are going to live in is at stake. Don't fight for me, fight for you.
And, by extension, in the subject here, I think the same is true for homophobia, transphobia, any form of prejudice or oppression. So we just have about 2 minutes or so left of, obviously we only got to, as I knew would happen, I got to about 2 out of 6 questions I had written down. So I'm not sure if there's anything that either of you want to end with in particular, just to offer you that opportunity.
I'd like to uplift one thing. Lighthouse Church, for a long time, over our 7 years of existence, has been in a constant state of discernment for how we manifest social justice and live out the gospel in the world. And a year and a half that led us to founding a nonprofit organization, Lighthouse Foundation. And I uplift that because increasingly, I think faith communities are going to need to be more strategic and more unified about their approach to social justice activism. In my experience with many faith communities, they are doing 3 or 4 different social justice projects, and they are pet projects of the people who marshal them within the faith community. And more work, I think, has to be done at the level of pastoral leadership and also lay leadership around how does our faith community, in a targeted, faithful, consistent way, show up for anti-racism activity, right? Like, we aren't just going to show up at this environmental march because that's what Bob does, and then Susie over here tells us we got to put the Black Lives Matter sign on the church, and then Rob up the door says immigration is important. And basically those 3 people create social justice within that faith community. I just think that's a flawed strategy. We really have to think at the leader level and also the full congregational level, the full synagogue level, and vote and be intentional about investing maybe in 1 or 2 organizations rather than this shame-based scatterbrain stuff that predominantly white faith communities do. You know, when George, and this is a question that I want to leave predominantly white faith communities with, when George Floyd erupted, what set of Black people were you previously accountable to? Either an organization, a group of folk, an institution, but who were you accountable to? Because what was very interesting to me about faith communities is after George Floyd, everybody was like, "Oh, we gotta give money to racism. We gotta invest." But you should have been doing that before. And so now my question is, now that we're away from George Floyd, will you do it after? But if I could leave predominantly white faith communities with any question in this moment, it would be this: what Black folk are you accountable to?
Great question. Sandra, is there anything you'd like to add to this as we wrap up?
Yeah, I really just want to just let the air move around what Jamie said.
Yeah.
And if I can add, I don't even know what I was going to say before, but like George Floyd was a wake-up call to many, and sadly many people have already forgotten. And what it shows, like I think that many people in our country don't believe or didn't believe that racism exists unless it is caught on film. And when Black and brown people share their stories, um, many white people want to believe it's anything other than racism. And so, I think what I want white people to understand is, like, when marginalized people tell you that they experience racism, just listen. And don't try to pass it off as something else because you don't have that person's experience. And then for many of my friends over the years who said, well, I've got Black friends and they don't ever tell me about racism. And I often challenge them. I said, was there some point in time where your friend may have tried to share a racist story with you? And what was your reaction? And Black people are making choices all the time because I'm a Black person. I just assume our society is racist. And so when white people say things that are racist, doesn't mean I'm not going to be your friend. It just means you're just doing what I assumed you would do. And if I'm going to be invested in a relationship with you, then I'm going to talk to you about it. But we know that 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 just because of being in this country, we all suffer from the ills of racism. And just to have white people wake up. I mean, I am glad that, like, many people feel peer pressure to go out and protest, because that's how people learn. They learn from their friends, and maybe if they just it's fashionable now to have a Black Lives Matter. I'll take that as a sign in their yard, because that's definitely further along, because that's a constant memory for for people to understand that Black lives do matter. Um, and just to continue echoing that we need to listen to the experiences of Black folks and other marginalized folks, so that we can truly be a better society, and also live up to um, our own religious values, because we have more religious values in common than we don't. So then we don't have, what I'm trying to say. We have more in common than we don't have in common. So.
I mean, it just
I
makes
just
me
wanted to add.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
When Black people are disbelieved, it is an assault on our epistemology.
Yeah.
Like, so first, I have experienced a racist thing. And then when the white person that I'm sharing this with tries to say that it's not racist, now you are assaulting my ability to understand and discern truth, right? So you talk about gaslighting. So I mean, not only have I dealt with this racism, but now I have you messing with my epistemology. It's a profound assault. It really is.
Well, we could go on for hours, obviously. But I want to appreciate both of you, Jamie and Sandra, for sharing yourselves and your experience and your wisdom with everyone here and out there, wherever they are. And before we close up, I actually do want to give just a little plug for, I think this is working. Yes. So we have a weekly, actually it's tonight, a monthly queer spirituality support group at Bradbury-Sullivan. I'm one of the facilitators. All of the facilitators are various staff people or students from Lehigh University, which is great. And it's been some really wonderful conversations. So if anybody out there is watching, obviously right now, at least, it's all online, so you don't have to be in the area. So you can just go to the Bradbury-Sullivan website or Facebook page. It's the first Tuesday of every month at 7 o'clock. And which is good, because I was thinking it was 7:30. And, a story just popped into my mind just to close. As a rabbi, I would be remiss if I didn't close with a story. There's this great story in the Talmud, and I'm terrible. I'm great at remembering stories. I'm terrible at remembering exactly who said what, where, and when, and dates, and all of that. But somewhere in the Talmud, there's this argument among rabbis, which is pretty much what the Talmud is made up of, and they're trying to decide, and it's an arcane item of Jewish law. And the one rabbi, Rabbi Eliezer, says, it's this way. And all the other rabbis say, no, it's that way. And Rabbi Eliezer says, no, I'm right. And if I'm right, let this carob tree over here prove it. And the carob tree gets up and moves on its own to someplace else. And the other rabbis, instead of saying, oh, wow, he must be right, they said, yeah, sorry, carob tree doesn't determine how we're going to practice our lives. And then, okay, he says, if the tradition is according to me, let this stream prove it. And the stream all of a sudden starts flowing in the opposite direction. Again, rather than saying, okay, he's right, they're like, no, that's not how we're going to do it. I don't care. The stream doesn't prove anything. Finally, he says, okay, if I'm right, let a voice from heaven tell you. And a voice comes down from heaven saying, yeah, Rabbi Eliezer is right. You'd think that would convince the other rabbis, like, okay, and they say, no, sorry, we're right. A heavenly voice has no sway over us, because the Torah, our tradition, our law, our customs is no longer in heaven. It's down here with us. And as if that weren't enough, later on, somebody asks Elijah, who always pops up everywhere, how did God respond when this happened? And Elijah's response is, God laughed and said, my children have defeated me. So thank you for laughing. But, it made me think, people can tell us as much as we want as as queer people, and whether it's queer and spiritual, queer, Black and spiritual, people can tell us as much as you want, like, no, this is the way it's always been done. What you're doing is wrong, or you're in the right. But we determine for ourselves. I think it's a very queer text because it's saying, we as a community determine how we're going to do things, because our tradition, our law, it's not up in heaven, it's down here with us, and we have to grapple with it. And what the two of you are doing is really grappling with that text. And just like God, you're doing it with laughter too. We know that there are lots of tears as well, but it's the laughter that really makes it possible also. So I just want to thank both of you for all that you do and for being here today, and to thank Adrienne Shanker and the Bradbury-Sullivan Center and for sponsoring this program and allowing the two of you to come and share this with our greater community.